The candles on the 50th birthday cake flickered erratically with the air conditioning, like a troupe of tired dancers forced to continue their performance. Diane stood behind the crowd, her knuckles white as she gripped the cake knife. In front of her was Richard. His blue shirt hugged his still firm shoulders, his smile broad, his chin tilted slightly in the manner of a man accustomed to receiving accolades. The entire room was bathed in the soft golden light of the chandeliers, the clinking of glasses, and bursts of laughter. "Make a wish, my love," Diane said, her voice low enough for only them to hear. She heard her own voice as if from the bottom of a well. Richard raised his eyebrows, which sparkled. He looked around, took a deep breath, and blew out the candles. The room applauded. For a few seconds, darkness played peekaboo with faint glimmers. Then the lights came on, confetti rained down, and the guests oohed and awed again, overwhelmed. Diane presented her gift, a small box, ivory wrapping paper, a simple ribbon, all meticulous, in keeping with her 20 years of careful habits. Inside, a brand-new wristwatch lay as still as a tamed animal. A dark dial, a black leather strap, hands as calm as a promise. "You always understand me," Richard said, planting a quick kiss on her temple. Even his tenderness now felt like a learned ritual. He fastened the watch, extending his wrist to show off to his friends. "My wife has an eye for gifts." Whistles and playful banter flowed like wine. Diane smiled and raised her glass. She heard everyone's praise for the watch and saw Tanya, the brown-haired secretary in a green silk dress, standing awkwardly at the back of the room, hidden by a stone pillar, tilt her head slightly, her eyes flashing with an unnameable emotion. She noted it as a detective might place a small pin on a map. The watch, Diane thought, and with a smile, she pressed her thumb into her index fingernail until a stinging sensation spread up her arm. Done. The watch was running, and not just time. For beneath the scratch-resistant glass and dust-sized screws lay another heart, Diane's own mechanism, a miniature recording module, a GPS transmitter, and a storage chip skillfully soldered to the back of the casing. The old watchmaker in the neighborhood, who often joked, "Whose time isn't fleeting?" had looked up from his loop, staring at her longer than usual when she made her request. Diane smiled. A special gift for a special person. The moment Richard raised his glass in thanks, surveying the room like the lord of his domain, Diane took half a step back. She pressed the side of her wedding ring, feeling a tiny vibration. Her pulse slowed. Recording was active. Location was functioning. All neat, silent. "You just need to be happy tonight," she said, as the guests dispersed into small groups. Richard put his arm around her waist, a faint scent of unfamiliar perfume. Amber mixed with black pepper, a scent Diane had once tried on her wrist in a shop, only to realize it wasn't for her. This scent didn't cling to Richard's shirts when they shared a bed in their early years. This scent was new, and it knew its way back. "It's late," Richard said. "I have to leave early tomorrow." He winked, a sly smile of someone who believed he was perfectly hidden. "Business trip?" Diane tilted her head, her temple throbbing. "Yes, just one night, you know." He finished his champagne, set down the glass, and turned back to his friends. Diane watched his wrist as it flashed with steel. She lightly touched her pendant, where a tiny wireless earpiece was hidden. A barely audible sob entered. No, it was her own suppressed cry. On the half-eaten cake, the knife, still smeared with vanilla cream, lay like a gleaming blade. Diane placed it in the sink, rolled up her sleeves, and washed each plate, each glass. The housekeeper offered to help, but she shook her head. She needed to do it, with her own hands, to feel each fragment falling into the sink like time breaking. That meticulous habit was the only anchor keeping her from spiraling out of control. By midnight, the house was empty. The balloons sagged, touching the ceiling. Richard stood in the foyer, holding a black suitcase. His jacket was neat, his tie loosened. "You drive, so you don't get stuck in traffic," he said. "Are you okay?" Diane asked, playing the part of a trusting wife perfectly. "I'm fine. You should sleep early." She stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest. Through the fabric, she felt a steady heartbeat, a tireless machine for his private plans. "Good luck," she said. Mid-wish, her hand brushed his left wrist, a touch as light as a caress, but her eyes caught the small numbers on his watch face tick up. It was listening. The door closed. The engine sound receded down the slope. 2 red taillights faded like the concluding dots of a much too long chapter. Diane stood alone in the hall. She turned on the kitchen light, tidying up a few fallen ribbons, gathering the unopened gift boxes. She placed Richard's old watch, the silver steel one with worn edges, in the drawer. Life holds familiar objects so dear that we believe them immutable. Yet with a single slip, they are replaced by their cruelly accurate replicas. She brewed a pot of black tea, poured a cup but didn't drink it. The steam rose thin as mist, stinging her eyes. She went into the study, a room Richard rarely entered, deeming it as messy as a classroom. On the desk was her laptop, its screen already open to the interface of an obscure application, its icon as innocuous as a calendar. Diane sat down, her fingers poised above the keyboard, pausing for a brief moment, like the first time touching a door knowing a chasm lay beyond. She logged in. Device, R50. The name she'd given the watch, lit up green. Location, a highway route heading towards the sea. Speed, 85 km. Battery, 92%. Recording, active. In her ear, Richard's voice mingled with the sound of wind and radio music. He whistled along to a chorus. Then came the playful beep of a text message. His voice, "On my way. Old room." A pause. Then a woman's voice replied, seemingly from afar, with the sound of a phone vibrating. "I'll be waiting." Just 2 words, yet Diane felt her throat constrict, as if choked by fishing line. She pulled open a desk drawer. Inside lay a graphite-colored USB drive, a scratched leather-bound notebook, and a fountain pen with blue ink. She opened the notebook, turning to the page marked with a red ribbon. Neat, italicized lines, dates, times, locations, fleeting figures, perfumes, strange phone numbers. The investigation journal she had meticulously kept for 6 months. Each line was a handful of hot embers hidden in her chest. Diane took a deep breath. Her right hand began to tremble, an old habit whenever she was about to set in motion something irreversible. She opened a new window, navigated to her email. Subject, "Happy 50th, Richard." She uploaded a photo of them blowing out candles. She looked at her own face in the picture, smiling just enough, eyes sparkling just enough. Life taught women one skill, to smile with the right dosage to conceal something that was dying. She didn't send the email to anyone. She saved it to drafts, like bait set in the right place, waiting for the opportune moment. Outside the window, rain began to fall. Rain pattered on the brick patio, flowing in streams along the edge of the flower beds. Diane pulled her chair closer to the window, opening it a crack, letting the scent of wet earth drift in. "We'll see this through," she murmured, unclear to whom. To the watch? To the man driving to meet another woman? Or to the woman in the mirror who had learned to say fine so many times she believed it herself? The phone vibrated. A group message from friends. "Party was amazing, Diane. You're the best." She hit like, then turned off the screen. The praise of outsiders was always like a thin layer of frosting on a dry cake, pretty, meaningless. 2 a.m. The green cursor stopped at the parking lot of a seaside hotel. A familiar name pricked Diane's eyes. It was the very place she had booked for their 15th anniversary, with white roses and wine. That day, Richard had to leave early because of an urgent client. Today, he came to the same place to meet another client. The circle closed, like a story that knew exactly where to inflict the most pain. The sound in the earbuds changed. the clack of men's shoes on wet stone, the slide of glass doors, the receptionist's "good evening." Then silence. So profound, Diane could hear her own breath echoing in her ear. She pulled up the high stool at the minibar in her study, placed the laptop on the shelf, angling the screen towards her face. The cold blue light on her cheekbones made her look like a character on the fringe of a crime film. She raised a hand to her chest, searching for her pulse. Just then, a soft female voice sounded. "You're here?" The door closed. The rustle of silk fabric. A man's chuckle. Deep, too familiar. Diane didn't turn it off. She didn't rush to the car, didn't call, didn't scream. She sat still, listening, word by word, like a doctor placing a stethoscope on the chest of an illness needing diagnosis. Every laugh, every promise she absorbed, labeled and filed away, evidence upon evidence. At one point, Richard said, his voice confident, a little boastful, that the job was almost done, that we'll have a house by the sea soon, that Diane suspects nothing, you know her. Tanya giggled, her sound as soft as candy. Diane narrowed her eyes. She placed her pen on the notepad, writing, "House by the sea." She circled it twice, the strokes tightening. A gust of wind slipped through the slightly open window, carrying the scent of fresh rain. Diane unconsciously closed it, locking herself in with the smell of old wood and paper. She opened a cabinet and took down a small box, the one that had held Richard's watch years ago when they were first married. It was empty inside. Everything had its place, and emptiness was the most perfect confession. The desk phone rang softly. An internal line she'd installed specifically for the study, connecting only to the bedroom. She watched the blinking numbers. Richard. Her hand suddenly felt light as down. She picked up. "You're still up?" Richard's voice in that familiar, soothing tone. "Yes," Diane replied, keeping her volume steady. "Did you have a good party?" "Yes. I just wanted to say thank you for the watch. I really like it." A brief silence. "It makes me feel young again." Diane curved her lips, not letting a laugh escape. "I'm glad you like it," she said. "It suits you so well." And she added very softly, like a lullaby, or a curse, "It will be with you every minute." Richard didn't understand, or didn't hear. "I'll be back by noon tomorrow. Go to sleep, okay?" He hung up. On his end, he was probably returning to the hotel room and his woman. On this end, Diane placed the receiver down as if it were a fragile, heavy object. She turned back to the screen. The green dot remained stationary in the hotel parking lot, then slowly moved up a floor. She looked at the magnified map, room 714. The room number flashed for a second on the reception log. She was used to reading such inadvertently revealed snippets of data. She pulled out a sticky note, wrote 714, and stuck it to the edge of the screen. Simple, clean, like the way she arranged bottles in the kitchen. Inside, something quietly fell. Not the sound of a breaking heart, that had broken long ago, but the click of a bolt being drawn. From that moment on, everything was behind the bolt. She was no longer on this side of her old life. Diane turned off the living room lights, leaving only the laptop screen as the sole source of light. Her shadow stretched across the wooden floor, passing over a ribbon, over scattered pieces of wrapping paper, over an empty watch box. She bent down, picked up a piece of ribbon, and wrapped it around her finger. It tightened, turning red. The real, sharp pain, like a needle prick, made her eyes dry again. She pulled out a chair and sat up straight. Her right hand rested on the mouse. On the toolbar, there was a padlock icon, unlocked. With a single click, all the audio data from the watch would be automatically backed up to the drive she had inserted. She took a deep breath, clicked. A small tick sound was heard. A loading circle appeared. Diane closed her eyes for a beat. When she opened them again, the circle was complete, turning green. At the bottom of the map screen, A notification popped up. R50, stable connection, real-time location update. Below the screen, text scrolled like a reminder. Don't let the screen sleep. Don't worry, Diane said, looking at the bright green dot on the map as if into the pupil of a cornered animal. I'm a long way from letting it sleep. Outside, the rain continued to fall steadily. Inside, the second hand on the wall clock in the study continued to tick forward, steady, persistent. And somewhere on the coast, another watch had just begun its story, a story in which Richard had no idea he was the main character. The wall clock showed past 3 in the morning. The darkness in Diane's room was thick, only the pale blue light from the laptop screen reflected on her face, making her cheekbones look as cold as porcelain. Her eyes still followed the tiny green dot on the map, moving very slowly before stopping. Room 714. She placed her fingers on the table and tapped lightly to the rhythm of her heart. A part of her, the part that once believed in love, still wanted to deceive herself. Maybe he was just at a meeting, discussing work. But her rationality chuckled dryly. Who has meetings in a seaside hotel at midnight? The wind tapped lightly against the window pane. Diane stood up and walked into the bedroom. The bedsheet still carried Richard's cologne. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her fingers playing with the corner of the blanket, her eyes fixed on the empty space where he used to lie. The room was so quiet that she could clearly hear the clock in the distant study echoing through the walls, each tick like a drop of water falling into her heart. On the dressing table, the wedding photo had faded. Richard, young, with confident eyes, a wide smile. Diane, in a simple white dress, a gentle smile, her hand placed on his chest. She lifted the photo and touched the glass with her fingertip. "You promised back then you would never make me cry," she whispered. "Now you've left me with no tears left to cry." Diane opened a drawer and took out another small notebook. On the first page, she had written in blue ink, "The day I decided to stop believing." Below it was a densely written list, dates, times, journeys, every small sign, Richard's late nights, strange receipts in his wallet, lipstick on his collar, a perfume scent that wasn't hers. She had wanted to tear up the notebook, but in the end, she kept it. Now, it was the only thing keeping her from dissolving. The rain continued to fall. She picked up her phone and opened the location app. The blue dot remained stationary. Below it, text appeared. "Signal stable, recording active." A light laugh came from the audio file. Tanya's voice, young, thin, and petulant. "Aren't you afraid of lying to your wife all the time?" And Richard's reply, a mixture of confidence and arrogance. "Afraid of what? Diane lives in her own world. She trusts me implicitly." That statement made the air in the room grow colder by a degree. Diane closed her eyes and exhaled softly. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, keeping her heart from exploding. A moment later, she opened her eyes, and within them there was no longer pain, only a clearly forming plan. Around 5 in the morning, the laptop screen flickered. Richard had turned off his watch. The blue dot disappeared. Diane nodded slightly. "All right." She stood up, went to the kitchen, and made a cup of black coffee. The bitter aroma spread throughout the house, awakening old memories. She remembered when Richard proposed, also on a rainy morning. He had knelt and said, "If there's one thing I will never betray, it's you." That promise, 20 years later, had become proof of irony. Diane looked around the kitchen, the place that was once the heart of their home. On the wall, the calendar displayed notes she had carefully written. Monday, parent-teacher meeting. Tuesday, cook his favorite dish. Small things that were once love. Now, they were just traces of a woman who once believed kindness could hold on to someone who wanted to leave. She returned to the study and opened the laptop. The audio file was downloading, piece by piece. Each file was a fragment of truth. She named the folder, Truth 01. Her fingers brushed over the USB drive, which already held the first pieces of evidence. The small light from it blinked, a steady, precise rhythm, like her heartbeat at this moment. A thought entered Diane's mind. If he could lie so well, so could I. No shouting, no hitting, no crying. She would fight with silence. Silence that would be recorded, stored, and would explode at the precise moment. The sky began to lighten. Faint light crept through the gaps in the curtains, illuminating Diane's face. Her eyes were shadowed, but strangely bright. She spoke softly, her voice a whisper, yet clear. You don't know I started when you thought everything was over. Outside, birds began to sing. Inside, a woman pressed save on her final file, then closed her laptop. The plan had been set in motion. The clock had awakened, and the countdown to revenge had begun. 15 years ago, when Diane still had hair down to her back and still loved to laugh aloud in the afternoon, Richard had been the center of her world. She met him at a small startup seminar in Boston. He spoke as if even the wind paused to listen. You seem to believe in practical things, he teased, but reality sometimes needs a bit of fantasy to survive. Diane smiled then. Then you be my fantasy. They married one sunny autumn. The wedding was simple, with only close friends, a white lace dress she had sewn herself, and Richard reading vows that everyone thought he had written from the bottom of his heart. In their early years, they lived in a small third-floor apartment where every night Diane set an early alarm to make coffee for her husband, and Richard would leave notes saying, I love you a little more today than yesterday. Richard's career began to flourish. He built his own company, expanding step by step. Diane, a magazine editor by profession, quit her job when she had their first child. We'll build this home together, he said. And she believed him. In the evenings, she sat on the living room floor, reviewing his accounting statements, listening to him talk about contracts and partners. Whenever he was tired, she massaged his shoulders and made him ginger tea. Richard would often take her hand. Without you, I am nothing. And each time, Diane's heart would flutter like a child's. But love, when wrapped in too much tranquility for too long, wears away in places we cannot see. In their 10th year, Richard became increasingly busy. Phones rang all night, dinners were postponed, vacations canceled midway. It's work, my love, he'd say, and Diane would nod, believing him. She was busy taking care of the child, managing the household, comforting the child's small fears whenever their father was away. One night, Richard came home late, the smell of smoke clinging to his clothes. Late meeting, he explained, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek. She smiled, poured him a glass of water, and then lay quietly, listening to the shower. In the steam, she caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror, so unfamiliar it made her heart skip a beat. But the next morning, he made her coffee and put fresh flowers on the table. I still remember your favorites, he said. And Diane reassured herself again. Perhaps I am being too suspicious. He's just tired. The small cracks began there, from her not asking and him not telling. From her believing that silence meant keeping the peace, while he saw silence as agreement. In her journal, Diane wrote the first line of the rift. When love needs to be proven, it means it has begun to die. Time passed, and Richard's changes didn't arrive like a thunderclap, but through small details, things no one would notice, but to Diane, they were like cracks on a glass. Initially faint lines, then spreading across the entire surface. He still came home, still hugged their child, still asked, Are you okay? But his eyes no longer met hers when he asked. They were distant, as if searching for someone else somewhere behind her. One winter morning, Diane reached out to tie Richard's tie as she always did, but he pulled away slightly, saying, I'll do it myself, you rest, you look tired. The words, light as a breeze, made her freeze. For the first time in years, he didn't let her touch him. From that day on, she realized, when a man no longer needs our touch, it means a distance has begun to be built with cold bricks. Then came the evenings. Richard would bring his laptop, saying, "I have urgent work." The screen's light cast a glow on his face, a face whose every feature Diane knew now seemed covered in a layer of frost. She sat opposite, reading a book, but her eyes only watched his silhouette in the reflection of the window pane. He chuckled to himself, occasionally typing messages, his fingers moving with a rhythmic swiftness. "Is work that enjoyable?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Richard looked up, a smile gracing his lips. "A lovely partner, which eases the pressure." She forced a smile, trying to believe it was just a joke. But that night, while clearing the table, she saw the words, "Good night, boss," light up his phone screen before it went dark. Richard slept soundly. Diane stood watching him for a long time. That face, the one that once made her believe in the best of marriage, now held a distant quality, no longer belonging to this home. She didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't interrogate. She simply observed. She took note of everything. How he'd changed his cologne, how he meticulously styled his hair, how he lingered at the mirror. The gestures of a man who wanted to be seen, but not by his wife. In her small diary, Diane wrote, "He no longer looks at me with the eyes of a man who loves his wife. He sees me as standing between memory and duty." She tried to change, cut her hair, bought new dresses, cooked his favorite meals again. Richard praised them as beautiful, delicious, skillful, then rushed out of the house. His compliments now felt like empty shells of once loving words. Another evening, Diane opened the laundry closet and found a coral lipstick in Richard's suit pocket, a shade she'd never used. Her heart skipped a beat. She held it in her palm, examining it, small, shiny, still warm. Its scent was sweet and inexpensive. She placed the lipstick on her own vanity, among her older shades. The next morning, Richard noticed it, a flicker of unease crossing his face, then asked, "Did you buy a new lipstick?" "No," Diane replied calmly. "You brought it home." A heavy silence followed. Richard chuckled, a touch forced. "Someone must have left it in my car." "Someone?" Diane asked, her gaze still soft. "Who was it?" "A client. I met a female client yesterday." She nodded, saying nothing more. But inside, a door closed. That night, as Richard slept, Diane picked up the lipstick again, uncapped it, and with a trembling hand wrote on the mirror, "When women fall silent, they are remembering." She looked at the words reflected in her eyes, eyes that held both pain and something quiet, cold as steel. She whispered, "I will not lose you. I will make you lose yourself." The day everything became undeniably clear began like any other morning. Richard left the house earlier than usual. He mentioned a meeting with new shareholders, and Diane, as always, simply nodded and poured him more coffee. But after he left, the lingering scent of his cologne in the air felt suffocating, amber mixed with black pepper. She opened the window, letting the breeze rush in, but the fragrance remained on the cup, the napkin, the very atmosphere of the kitchen that was once their sanctuary. Something had taken love's place here. That afternoon, while tidying the wardrobe, Diane found Richard's favorite white shirt. The collar bore a faint lipstick stain, not the coral from before, but a deep wine red. Strangely, Diane did not cry. She just stood silently, then smiled faintly. "You're not as good at hiding things as you think, Richard," she whispered. From that day on, Diane became a different person. Not because she wanted to, but because her heart no longer chose to endure. A wife turns detective. In the evening, while Richard was showering, Diane took his phone and plugged it into the laptop. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but her instinct told her that the truth always leaves a trace, and it was indeed there, In the recents folder, a blurry photo of a wine glass on a table, and in the distance, a woman's hand with a butterfly ring. No face was visible, but none was needed. Diane copied the photo, saved it to a small folder on her laptop, and named it something. From that day on, she began to observe not with her heart, but with her mind. She marked down the times Richard left home, the times he returned, took photos of the gas receipts he left in his pocket, and noted down the days he said he was on a business trip. All meticulously written in a leather-bound notebook, each page accompanied by small, neat symbols, just as she used to write down recipes for her husband. One evening, when he returned, Diane asked, "Where was the meeting today?" "At headquarters. It was very intense." She nodded. "Why is there sand dust on your shirt?" Richard paused, but only for a second, then laughed. "Must have been in the parking lot." Diane smiled. She looked him straight in the eye, the first time in months. That gaze made him look away. When trust dies, clarity blooms. At night, when the house was asleep, Diane sat by the window, opened her laptop, and brought up the tracking map for Richard's car. She had secretly installed a small device in the trunk, under the lining. It started as mere curiosity, but now it was living proof. The first time she tracked him, her heart pounded so fast her hands trembled. But after a few nights, she found herself strangely calm. She watched the moving dot on the map as if it were a game with rules. Richard said he was meeting at the office, but his car stopped in front of the Blue Horizon Hotel, the place he had promised to take her for their anniversary. The blue screen's light reflected in her eyes, and Diane suddenly understood. "There are places you never took me, because you kept them for someone else." She didn't call, didn't confront him. Silence had become her weapon. A fateful encounter. One afternoon, Diane unexpectedly visited Richard's office, bringing a box of his favorite pastries. The secretary greeted her with an unfamiliar smile. A young woman with curly brown hair, lips the color of wine, the same color lipstick on Richard's collar. "He's in a meeting," the girl said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "That's all right," Diane smiled. "I'm his wife. I just wanted to leave the pastries." As Diane turned to leave, she could clearly feel the secretary's gaze on her back, a look that was both curious and proud. A faint intuition ran through Diane's mind. This was the woman in the photograph. That evening, Richard came home late. Diane was still waiting, the desk lamp illuminating the open notebook. "You lied to me," she said softly, without a tremor. "You didn't have a meeting today." "Are you suspecting me again?" His voice was annoyed. "No, I'm just taking notes." She closed her notebook, stood up, and walked toward the bedroom, leaving him standing there. Richard watched her go, a flicker of confusion on his face. Perhaps for the first time, he realized the woman before him was no longer the old Diane. When pain becomes a plan. That night, Diane opened her drawer and took out a small box. Inside were electronic components she'd bought online. A mini audio recorder, a GPS tracking chip, and a tiny battery. She placed each item on the table and gazed at them. Everything was tiny, harmless, but she knew it could shatter a life. She began to assemble them, her hands trembling slightly but precisely. In that moment, she realized she was no longer a victim. She was becoming the author of her own story. Diane looked up at her reflection in the mirror. Her face mirrored eyes that were no longer wet. "I'm not trying to salvage this," she said to her image. "I'm trying to remember." Light reflected in her eyes, the light of someone awake, no longer afraid of the dark. The February chill crept into the house like a stalking cat. Richard was still up late in his study, while Diane sat on the sofa, curled in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the light spilling from under the door. She no longer asked what he was doing, nor did she wait for him to go to bed. She just sat silently, listening to the tap of the keyboard, the clink of a coffee mug being set down, and the occasional sigh. They had entered a phase of silent warfare, where every word was a knife and every silence a minefield. Diane began to say things that weren't true, just to see how Richard would react. One morning, she casually remarked, "Linda said you've been looking thin lately. Must be a lot of work, huh?" Richard froze, his eyes showing a hint of suspicion. "Linda saw you? I thought you hadn't been in touch with her for a long time." "Oh, she saw you at the coffee shop on Central Street," Diane said, her voice natural. "With a brunette. A business partner, I assume?" Richard gave a slight laugh, but sweat beaded on his temples. "You must have misheard. I was with my assistant discussing work. It was nothing." "Yes, I suppose so," Diane smiled, taking a sip of her coffee. "You're always so busy with work." From then on, Richard began to be wary of her. He hid his phone more carefully, locked his laptop, and even turned off his computer whenever she entered the room. But his very caution was a greater betrayal than anything else. Diane didn't need more proof. She just needed to confirm her instincts were right. And now, every sign was singing the same tune in unison. He was cheating. One Friday evening, Richard said he had to fly to Chicago for 2 days. Diane smiled, packed an extra scarf for him, prepared his suitcase, and even reminded him, "Remember to take your vitamins and don't skip meals." Richard hugged her and kissed her forehead. "You're truly the most wonderful wife." The door closed. The sound of the car engine faded into the distance. As soon as the taillights disappeared, Diane took out her phone and opened the car's tracking app. The pinpoint of light was not heading towards the airport. It turned south, towards the seaside city. She sat still, the blue light on the screen dancing in her eyes. Her heart beat calmly. "So it begins," she murmured, her voice almost relieved. She turned on the home recorder, not because Richard would hear anything, but to capture the sound of her own loneliness. Around 1 a.m., the landline phone rang softly. Diane picked up, and on the other end, she heard male breathing, followed by a familiar voice, slightly drunk, with the distant sound of waves. "Are you asleep?" She recognized Richard's voice, and for a moment she found it ridiculous. "No, why are you calling?" "I just miss you." "Do you miss me in Chicago or by the sea?" A heavy silence. Richard coughed dryly. "You're suspecting me again. I'm at the hotel with a business partner, that's all." "Yes, I know," Diane said, her voice as light as the wind. "Room 312, right?" Richard fell silent. Only the sound of the wind through the receiver remained. She smiled and hung up first. That brief phone call was a small dagger she plunged into his pride, and she knew from this moment on Richard would not sleep peacefully. When Richard returned from his business trip, Diane had dinner ready, pan-seared salmon, red wine, flickering candles. He looked surprised. "Is there a special occasion?" "No," Diane replied, her tone calm. "I just wanted to have dinner with you like we used to." They sat opposite each other, the candlelight reflecting on their faces. Diane poured him wine, looking deep into his eyes. "Do you know," she said, "they say that when two people truly loved each other, they can always sense when the other is lying." Richard froze, his wineglass stopping midair. "You're philosophizing again," he said with a forced laugh. She took a sip, her eyes never leaving him. "No, I'm just telling the truth. And you know, lately, I've been sensing a lot." He put down his glass, avoiding her gaze. The dinner continued in silence, broken only by the clinking of silverware against plates. But in the room, the air was so heavy that even the candles seemed to burn lower. As Richard went upstairs, Diane cleared the table, washing each glass, a faint smile on her lips. "You think you're hiding something," she whispered, "but you're actually just following the script I wrote." The next evening, Diane opened her laptop and looked at the map. Richard left home again, claiming an impromptu meeting. The green dot moved, stopping at a small apartment in the city center. Diane didn't follow. She just recorded it. At this point, she understood. Catching him in the act was no longer important. What she wanted was for Richard to fall when he felt safest, at that very moment. She looked at the screen, her eyes gleaming with a strange light, no longer that of someone hurt, but of someone in control. "You dug a hole," she said softly. "I'm just helping you fall in faster." She closed the laptop and stood up. Outside the window, the rain was falling heavily. Each drop hitting the glass sounded like a countdown. She began to visit the small watch shop at the end of the street, where the old owner still familiarly called customers by his warm, raspy voice. "I need to replace the battery and adjust the internal structure a bit," Diane said, placing Richard's old watch on the counter. The old man looked at her through thick glasses, slightly surprised. "Adjust the internal structure?" "Yes," she smiled. "I want to add a more accurate time sensor." The old craftsman frowned, but then took the watch, muttering, "Everything in life can be adjusted. Only time cannot." "You're mistaken," Diane replied, her eyes reflecting the light of hundreds of clock faces hanging on the wall. "Time can be recorded if one is skilled enough." That evening, she returned home and placed the small package on her desk. Inside was not only the disassembled watch, but also several components she had found online: a GPS tracking chip, a miniature recording module, and a battery as thin as paper. She read the instructions, soldering each connection, as patient as if she were stitching up a wound. The faint smell of burnt metal filled the air, mixed with the scent of cooling chamomile tea beside her. When the final circuit connected, a small light flickered on. Diane smiled, for the first time in months. She held the watch in her hand, feeling its fragile life, as if listening to her own heartbeat merge within it. She whispered, "From now on, you won't be able to hide anything anymore." She opened her laptop, installed the tracking software, and checked the connection. Each line of code that scrolled across the screen, each blinking signal made her feel more stable. No more chaos, no more pain, only the absolute focus of someone who had decided to step out of the victim's role. When she was done, Diane placed the watch in a gift box, wrapped in ivory paper and tied with a neat ribbon. She wrote on a small card, "For the one who is always on time for every appointment." Then she turned off the lights and sat in the darkness, letting only the light from the box glint. In the silence, she clearly saw every tick of the second hand. The ticking was no longer the rhythm of time, but the countdown to a plan that had been set in motion. She closed her eyes, resting her head against the chair. In her mind, Richard's image appeared, his smile, his eyes, his voice. All that was once love, now just data to be recorded. She whispered, "We will cherish this memory together, my love. Except this time, it will be truthful." 3 days later, Richard returned home late, carrying the familiar scent of perfume that Diane had memorized note by note. He hugged her briefly, then put down his suitcase, saying, "Work was exhausting. I just want to rest." "I have a gift for you," Diane said, her voice as light as silk. He looked at the small gift box on the table, the ivory wrapping paper, the delicately tied ribbon. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion at all. I just saw how hard you've been working." Richard opened the box. The black watch lay inside, its cold steel reflecting in his eyes. "It's beautiful. You chose exactly my style." "I know," Diane replied. "I always do." He smiled and put it on his wrist. The second hand began to move. The ticking was very soft, but to Diane, each sound was like a hidden beat in her heart, a witness to the lies to come. Richard stood before the mirror, adjusting his wrist, and asked, "Do I look okay?" "You look perfect," Diane said, looking at him in the reflection. "Like a perfect man." As he turned away, she stepped closer, her finger lightly touching his wrist where the metal met his skin. Don't ever take it off, okay? Why so? I heard that wearing a watch on your wrist makes you lose track of time easily. Richard chuckled. If I forget the time, who will remember it for you? The words, though seemingly harmless, touched Diane's heart in its deepest core. She nodded, smiling. Yes, you won't forget. As he went to sleep, she remained in the darkness, her eyes fixed on the faint glow emanating from the watch face he'd placed on the table. She opened her laptop, and a small line of text appeared on the connection status. New device activated, battery 100%, auto recording enabled. Leaning back in her chair, she gently closed her eyes, letting the ticking sound seep into her very being. For the first time in months, Diane felt a sense of peace. Not peace from forgiveness, but peace from the certainty that the truth could no longer be hidden. She whispered to herself, "From now on, I will hear everything. I will see everything. And by the time you realize, it will be too late." Outside, the rain began to fall. It drummed against the window pane like an amplified clock's beat. Slow, steady, patient, and cold. In the room illuminated only by the dim glow of the screen, Diane sat up straight, opened her notebook, and wrote the latest entry. February 14th. The perfect gift. The game begins. She closed the notebook, a faint smile playing on her lips. In the hallway, Richard stirred in his sleep, unaware. A gust of wind slipped through the door crack, rustling the paper on the table, and on the screen, the first dot flickered. The watch had begun its countdown. 3 nights after Richard received the watch, Diane woke up at 2 a.m. The light from her laptop screen cast a bluish hue on her face, illuminating her tired eyes. On the tracking software, a blue dot was moving slowly, leaving the house, circling the avenue, heading towards the city center. She switched to live listening mode. The sound of an engine, the wind whistling through a car window. Then Richard's voice, deep, familiar, tinged with excitement. "I'm on my way. Don't fall asleep." Diane froze. Her heart pounded, but her hands remained steady. A woman's voice replied, young, clear, and as delicate as a plucked string. "Hurry, I've been waiting all day." Without needing a name, Diane knew, Tanya. She listened as they talked, laughed, and sometimes fell into silence, punctuated only by the sound of their breathing. Each exchange felt like a tiny needle piercing her skin, not enough to kill, but enough to feel every throb of pain. Yet, instead of turning it off, Diane quietly opened a new folder, named it rlog01, and saved the first audio file. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes remained sharp, unnervingly alert. The next day, Diane woke up early, cleaned the kitchen, and prepared breakfast. When Richard walked in, she turned her back to him, her voice even. "Did you sleep well?" "Yeah, all right. I've been having trouble sleeping lately." "Because of work?" "Yeah, this new contract is giving me a headache." She turned back, her smile as thin as paper. "You should rest more. Maybe sleep somewhere quiet. By the sea, perhaps." He paused for a moment, then laughed, a hint of embarrassment in his voice. "Good idea. You should start a vacation consulting service." She smiled back, while in her mind, the sounds from last night still echoed. Tanya's laughter, Richard's voice saying, she'd never suspect. 3 days later, Richard announced he had a business trip for the weekend. Diane nodded, bidding him farewell with a smile. When he left, she went into her study, opened her laptop, and tracked the little blue dot. This time, it stopped at the Blue Horizon Hotel, a name she'd seen in the car's data. She turned on the listening mode, and this time, there was more than just laughter. There were clinking glasses, the rustle of silk, and Richard's voice. "I want to start over. No more lies. You'll be the only one." Diane closed her eyes, leaning back in her chair, and took a deep breath. In her ear, Tanya replied softly, "What about your wife?" She won't know." The sound shattered like champagne bubbles. Diane opened her eyes, looking at her reflection on the laptop screen, a woman terrifyingly calm. She opened the recording file, rewinding each segment, noting the time, hotel name, voices, and even the phrase, "she won't know." At the bottom she wrote, "Enough evidence to end everything, but the time isn't right yet." Richard returned home 2 days later. She made coffee and placed it in front of him, asking gently, "Was the business trip okay?" "Fine." "Where was it?" "Chicago." "What was the hotel's name?" He frowned, looking up slightly. "Blue. No, Hyatt." His speech faltered. Diane smiled, her eyes gentle but with a deep, burning light. "Sounds familiar. Maybe I should have come with you next time." "No need. You stay home and take care of yourself." He smiled and left the table, unaware of her hand subtly clenching the coffee spoon until her knuckles turned white. She sat still, watching the steam rise from her coffee cup, the voices from the night before echoing in her mind, the loving words he spoke to someone else. The scent of coffee mingled in the air, bitter and numbing. As night fell, Richard slept soundly, while Diane sat alone in the living room. She turned on her laptop and replayed the recordings. His voice filled the room, intimate, affectionate. The voice that was once her warmth, now turned into living proof of betrayal. Midway through the recording, Tanya laughed. "Are you afraid your wife will find out?" "Why would I be? She's too kind to suspect anyone." Diane stopped the recording and looked around the house. Everything was in its place. The wedding photo, the vase, the scarf she had embroidered by hand. All of it stood as silent witnesses to a marriage dissolving without anyone realizing it. She spoke softly, her voice barely a whisper. "You're mistaken, Richard. Being kind doesn't mean being stupid." She chose to save the third audio file, naming it RLog03, The Lie. On the screen, the recording time read 3:14 a.m. Diane leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. In a fleeting dream, she saw fragments of sound falling like rain, piecing together into a giant clock, its hands spinning backward, rewinding through moments of love. But as she reached out, the glass face cracked, shattering into thousands of shards of light. She woke with a gasp, breathing heavily. Outside, dawn was breaking, pale as the face of someone who had run out of tears. In the nascent light of day, Diane understood she could no longer turn back. What she was doing had crossed the line of forgiveness, but she also knew, only by reaching the end of the truth could she find freedom. She glanced at the watch on her wrist. The second hand ticked steadily, as if counting her heartbeat. "Keep talking," she whispered. "Every word you say will be your sentence." On the fourth day, more recordings continued to download. Diane sat in her study, the blinds partially drawn, light spilling onto her desk like shimmering water. Her hands no longer trembled when she opened a file. Each sound was now like a page in a book that needed to be read to understand the story she was living. The new recording began with the sound of a car engine, then Richard's voice, sounding somewhat rushed. "I've cleaned it all up. No one knows. Not even her." Tanya's voice replied, with a short laugh. "Are you sure? I don't want to get dragged into this." "Trust me. Diane trusts me blindly. All the paperwork is in her name, so no one can trace it back to me." Diane went still. She rewound, listening more closely. "All the paperwork is in her name." Her heart pounded. Images flashed in her mind. Stacks of documents, accounts, contracts, all the things Richard had asked her to sign for convenience. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old file. Every sheet bore her name, her neat signature just below his company's name. She flipped through each page, each number, her grip tightening with every word she read. Richard hadn't just betrayed her emotionally, he was setting financial traps around her, using her as a shield. The recording continued, each sentence a knife slicing through her flesh. "When it's all done, I'll transfer the assets. She won't know a thing. And then? You'll leave her? I'll lie one last time, then disappear. Diane sat in silence. No tears, no screams, only the sound of heavy breathing and the feeling of a hollow chest as if it had been hollowed out. Every sound in her earphones became wind, swirling in her head. She closed the file, her eyes fixed on the darkness before her. "Do you want to disappear, Richard?" she whispered. "No need. I'll do it for you. Only this time, you'll disappear in an unexpected way." She turned on the computer, saved the fourth recording, marked in red. R-Log 04, the betrayal plan. Everything had gone beyond betrayal. Now it was a crime. Diane sat silently, gazing at the screen, the blue light reflecting on her cheekbones, her eyes filled with cold composure. No longer a wife, no longer a victim. She was the one holding all the cards. She closed the notebook, stood up, put the file into the safe, locked it, and looked towards the stairs, where Richard was sleeping soundly upstairs. The dim light cast her shadow on the wall, thin, long, resolute. "Your game is about to have new rules," she said softly, "and I'm the one writing them." Richard woke up later than usual. When he went down to the kitchen, Diane had already prepared coffee, baked bread, and was arranging flowers on the table. The air smelled of oranges and cinnamon, as gentle as if nothing had ever happened. He smiled, walked over, and gently hugged her from behind, but she skillfully leaned away. "You're awake? I woke up early today to bake?" "It's been a while since we had breakfast together." Richard blinked, slightly confused, then nodded and pulled out a chair to sit down. "I thought you were busy lately." "No, I have more free time. Many things are worth reorganizing, don't you think?" "Yeah, perhaps." She placed a cup of coffee in front of him. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. Diane recognized the familiar evasion in his eyes, the way he always looked out the window when he felt guilty. While he ate, she asked softly, "Don't you find it strange that everything in the house has been put back in its proper place recently?" "I hadn't noticed." "I noticed every little thing." She paused, a faint smile on her lips. "Because things that are out of place are often what people want to hide the most." Richard looked up, a flicker of caution in his gaze. Diane met his gaze, her smile still soft, as if she had just made a harmless joke. But inside, she registered every small movement, the way his eyes blinked rapidly, the way his hand gripped the coffee spoon tighter than usual. Guilt always has its own rhythm. At noon, Richard went out. She waited until the sound of his car disappeared completely before opening her laptop. The map lit up, a blue dot moving towards a familiar street, the location of his company's office building. But it didn't stop there. It turned in another direction, circled the city center, and headed down a road Diane had memorized after many nights of surveillance. Apartment 27 on Park Street. She made a note in her book, then took out her phone, opened the recording app, and connected it to the laptop's microphone. She adjusted the volume, and Richard's voice emanated from the speakers. "Everything's fine. I'm on my way to see her. Just stay quiet. We'll be done soon." She rewound slowly, listened again, then turned on the autosave feature. On the screen, the sound waves flickered rhythmically, like her own slowing heartbeat. "He's meeting her." The words echoed, repeated. Her. It turned out that in Richard's story, the her wasn't Diane, but Tanya. She stood up, walked to the filing cabinet, and pulled out an envelope with the bank's logo. Inside were copies of the stock contracts Richard had asked her to sign. Each page bore Diane's signature, right below his company's name. Every stroke of the pen now felt like a foolish tattoo on her own skin. She placed the envelope on the table, her gaze as still as the water before a storm. "You used my name to hide what you were doing," she whispered. Then I'll use exactly what you left behind to expose it all." That evening, Richard came home late. Diane was watching the news, the TV light reflecting on her face. He approached, tired, and pecked her forehead perfunctorily. "I'm home. How was work today?" "Yeah, long meeting. I'm dead tired." Diane turned off the TV and turned to face him. "You know, some things people think they can hide forever, but actually, with just one careless moment, the truth will reveal itself." Richard frowned. "Are you being philosophical again?" "No," she replied softly. "I'm just talking about trust." He gave a forced smile, put down his briefcase, and went upstairs. As his footsteps faded, Diane returned to her laptop, headphones in hand. A new file had just been downloaded. Tanya's voice, mocking, emerged. "How long are you going to let your wife keep all the documents? What if she finds out?" "She won't. Diane trusts you blindly. She never looks closely at what she signs." A muffled laugh rang out. Richard's. Diane took off her headphones and let them drop onto the table. She stood up and walked to the large mirror in the living room. The yellow lamplight reflected on her face. Calm, cold, and unfamiliar. "Yes, I haven't looked closely," she whispered, "but now I am." She returned to the table, opened her notebook, and wrote a new line. Date 26. You were too confident, too soon. Then she flipped to another page, drew a circle, and wrote 2 letters in the center. Next move. Richard began to notice something odd in the house, though he couldn't pinpoint what it was. Small items like the pen holder, a photo frame, or his favorite vest were slightly out of place, not enough to arouse suspicion, but enough to make him feel uneasy. One morning, he looked around his desk and frowned slightly. "Did you tidy up my room?" "No," Diane replied, pouring coffee. "What's wrong? Is something out of place?" "No. Maybe you're misremembering." She smiled, her eyes never leaving her coffee mug. "You often misremember things, but this time, I think you should get used to that feeling." He looked up. "What do you mean?" "It's nothing, just sometimes selective memory is a good thing. People only forget what they want to forget." She spoke, then placed the coffee cup before him and walked away slowly, leaving behind a faint scent of perfume and a mysterious smile. Richard watched her go, a shiver running down his spine, as if in this house something unseen was observing his every move. That evening, Diane started her laptop. The screen displayed a series of new audio files. She selected one and pressed play. Richard's voice came through, tired but softened as he spoke to Tanya. "I think she's starting to suspect." "How so?" "I don't know. She's quieter. Her eyes are different. I feel like she knows everything already." "Then let her know," Tanya chuckled. "Then you just need to disappear, as planned." Diane leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and listened to those words again. A thin smile touched her lips. "Disappear? You will, but not in the way you think." The next day, she placed a small box in his study. Inside were only a few blank sheets of paper, but on the lid, she had written a line in red pen, "For your eyes only." Richard found the box that afternoon. He opened it to find it empty. He frowned, checked his surroundings, then asked his wife, "Did you put this on my desk?" "What?" "The box." "Oh, I put it there a while ago. I must have forgotten." "But it's empty inside." "Yes, that's right." Diane looked at him and smiled. "Because I think some things don't need to be written down. You can understand just by looking." Richard stood still for a few seconds, unsure whether to laugh or be afraid. As he turned away, Diane saw his hand clench, the same reaction as someone being watched. That night, Diane got out of bed while Richard slept soundly. She tiptoed downstairs, opened the storage cabinet, and took out a USB drive. It contained all the audio files sorted by date, time, and location. She added a new folder, naming it Phase 2. The plan was no longer just about collecting information. She would manipulate Richard's emotions, making him fear his own shadow. The next morning, as Richard left the house, his phone received an anonymous message. "Someone knows. Be careful with your watch." He read it, frowned, and looked back at his wrist. His watch was still glowing, as normal. He deleted the message, shook his head, and reassured himself. It was probably spam. But all day long he kept glancing at his watch. Every time the second hand ticked, he felt as if someone was listening. In the evening when he returned home, he told Diane, his voice laced with confusion. "You know, I got a strange message today." "What message?" "It told me to be careful with my watch. Funny, right?" Diane looked at him, tilting her head. "Yeah, it's funny. But sometimes people warn you for a reason, Richard." He laughed to dispel the odd feeling, but deep down, fear had taken root. That night, as Richard slept, Diane stood by the window, watching the moonlight cast a glow on her hand. On her finger, the wedding ring sparkled, a symbol of vows, now transformed into the most silent weapon. She whispered, her voice barely audible to the wind. "You started the game, Richard. Now I'm just making you feel every step of it." She walked to the desk, opened her laptop, and pressed record. The screen lit up, capturing her voice, slow and clear. "Day 30. You're starting to get scared. Good. Fear will make you confess sooner than guilt." She saved the file, turned off the lights, and went upstairs. Upstairs, Richard tossed and turned, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Richard was starting to lose sleep. In recent nights, he often woke up in the middle of the night, listening to the ticking of the watch on his wrist, a once familiar sound now echoing like another heartbeat, one that didn't belong to him. Diane observed all these changes from afar, like a researcher monitoring her specimen. He drank more coffee, spoke less, and started to flinch every time his phone vibrated. She knew he was waiting for a message, but also dreading it. One morning, Richard casually asked, "Has anyone strange called the house lately?" "No," Diane replied. "Just some survey calls." "Yeah, strange." He said nothing more, but his eyes kept darting towards his watch. She smiled, watching him, her voice so gentle that he couldn't detect the hidden sharpness. "Maybe you should take it off for a bit. Let your wrist rest." "No, I'm used to it." "Are you afraid of losing track of time?" "No, it just calms me." Diane nodded. "Yes, that's right. Because it knows how to remember everything." That day, she sent a short audio file from an anonymous address to his work email. Just 30 seconds, Richard's voice speaking to Tanya. "Diane will never know. She trusts me completely." The email subject was simple. "Are you sure?" In the afternoon, Richard came home early, his face pale. He went into his study, poured a glass of wine, and downed it. Diane saw him and asked, "Are you tired?" "Yeah, work is a mess." "Have you told anyone about your situation?" He looked up, his eyes trembling slightly. "What is it?" "Oh," she shrugged. "I thought you were hiding something." He said nothing, just looked at her longer than usual. She continued to smile, gently turning the wedding ring on her finger, its gleam reflecting in his eyes like a reminder. That night, Richard went into his private study, turned on his computer, and checked his inbox. The email was gone. He had no idea how. Even less understandable was the small click from his wristwatch, as if someone were adjusting it remotely. He took it off and held it to his ear, but only heard the steady ticking of the mechanism. In the bedroom, Diane feigned sleep, her lips pursed to keep from laughing. She knew he was scared right now, and fear was the fastest path to confession. The next day, Richard started acting strangely. He removed his phone's battery, left his watch in the bathroom, and even turned off his laptop. But just then, Diane had finished installing another device, small as a pinhead, nestled within the wedding photo frame hanging by the desk. She just needed him to believe he had escaped. False confidence always made liars slip up. That evening, as they had dinner, Diane casually asked, "Where are you planning to go this weekend?" "The company has a retreat by the sea." "Blue Horizon?" Richard looked up, his smile freezing on his lips. "How did you know?" "I just guessed." "You like that place?" The air in the room grew heavy. She lifted her wine glass, took a small sip, and added, her voice nonchalant, "They say places where people once loved are often where they end everything." Richard didn't reply. His hand trembled, his glass tilted, spilling a red streak across the white tablecloth. Diane stood up, took a napkin to gently dab at it, her smile unwavering. "It's okay. I'm used to wiping away stains." That night, as Richard dozed off, Diane turned on her laptop, tracking the signal frequency from the watch. It was still working well. She opened a new recording file. No Tanya, just Richard speaking to himself, his voice hoarse and panicked. "Who sent the email? Who knows about this? Is it her? Impossible." Diane looked at the screen, whispering as if in reply, "Yes, it was her. The one you thought would never know." She saved the file and wrote a note at the bottom of her journal page. "He's starting to get scared. And I'm starting to feel peace." She closed the book and turned off the light. In the darkness, only the ticking of the watch could be heard, slow and deep, like the breath of someone about to realize that everything he hid was slowly speaking for itself. Richard left the house unusually early that morning, carrying a heavy black leather briefcase. Diane watched through the window as he glanced back before getting into his car, his look a mixture of anxiety and uncertainty, like someone trying to hide a wound he himself feared to see bleed. She smiled faintly and closed the curtains. On the desk, Richard's laptop remained on, its screen displaying accounting software he'd forgotten to close. An old habit saved her once again. Richard never locked his computer when in a hurry. Diane walked over, took a deep breath like a diver about to plunge into cold water, and sat in his chair. The screen displayed the familiar folders, work files, reports, marketing plans. But in the bottom corner, hidden beneath the neat row of icons, was a faded file named worktrip2023.zip. She maneuvered the mouse. A small lock icon appeared, a pale red. "You're so careless, Richard," she whispered, then opened the decryption tool she'd learned online. "Password?" She tried. Diane, Tanya, love, password, all wrong. She closed her eyes, recalling something Richard had said during their 10th anniversary dinner. "The most beautiful day of my life was September 12th. She typed, 12:09. The screen flickered, then opened. Inside was a labyrinth of data, invoices, photos, contracts, exchanges, and a subfolder, private video. Diane's hand trembled slightly. She clicked. The video opened, the image blurry. Richard was sitting at a dining table in the Blue Horizon Hotel, Tanya before him. They clinked glasses, candlelight reflecting in his eyes that once looked at her with love, now looked at another with innocent passion. Diane hit pause. Her breathing slowed, her eyes wide but tearless. She stared at the frozen frame, then took a deep breath and turned on the audio. Tanya's voice came through, clear. "I've sorted out all the paperwork. If everything falls apart, Diane will bear the debt. You owe me." A soft chuckle from Richard answered. "I promise, when this is over, we'll disappear. Diane won't be sharp enough to suspect." That sentence was like the sharp click of a knife on metal. Diane stood up, looking out the window where the sun had begun to fade. Everything around her suddenly seemed to expand, distant. She returned to the desk, plugged in a USB drive, and dragged all the data into a private folder named Hollow Marriage. The progress bar crawled. 20%, 45%, 78%, then stopped at 100%. She pulled out the drive and hid it in her pocket. Before leaving the chair, she opened Richard's notepad file. The last line hastily written. Diane started asking too many questions. Must act before she finds out. She stared at the words for a long time, then gave a small laugh, a mix of pity and contempt in her voice. Too late, my love. I knew before you even started thinking about hiding it. In the evening, Richard returned, his expression calm, but sweat dampening his collar. Diane was clearing the dinner table, a salad plate in her hand, and asked softly, "Was your workday good?" "Yeah, it was okay. Anything I can help with?" "No, just a bit tired." She nodded and put the plate down. "I tidied up your study for you. Your laptop looked rather messy." Richard froze. His eyes flickered rapidly towards her. Did you open my computer?" "No, I just wiped away the dust." He exhaled, a smile returning, but it was shaky, insincere. Diane turned her back, hiding a smile as thin as a blade behind her lips. She knew that from now on, every phone call, every email notification would make him flinch. He would start doubting his own shadow, and that was exactly what she wanted. As night fell, while Richard slept soundly, Diane opened her laptop. The USB drive was already plugged in. The screen displayed a small line of text. File extracted. 1. Hidden folder detected. She clicked Open. Inside was a stack of legal documents, along with a PDF file named Asset Transfer, Final Plan. She opened it. The content was a contract transferring all company shares to her name, the sole legal liability if anything went wrong. Below, Richard's signature and the full date were visible, perfect evidence of a calculated betrayal. Diane whispered softly, "Thank you, Richard. You've just signed your own death warrant." She saved a copy, printed 2 hard copies, placed one in the safe and the other in a sealed envelope, writing in red ink, "The hidden file." Then she sank into a chair, listening to the rain begin to patter on the roof. Inside the room, the ticking of the clock echoed steadily, slow, cold beats, signaling the real game had begun. Richard discovered something was wrong just 1 day later. He opened his laptop in his office, preparing to send an email to a partner, only to find the folder Work Trip 2023.zip had vanished. In its place was an empty file named Open Me. He clicked on it. Only a single line of text appeared on a black background. "Every lie leaves a trace. See you at home." Richard's hands trembled. Sweat slicked his back. He checked his hard drive again. There was no hidden file, no sign of intrusion. Everything had vanished cleanly, leaving only that cold line of text. A warning. He closed the laptop, stood up, and tried to maintain a calm demeanor in front of his employees, but inside, fear had reached his throat. That evening, when he returned, the house was lit and unusually tidy. Diane was sitting in the living room reading, the warm lamplight reflecting on her serene face. "You're home early?" she said, her voice steady. "Yes, work is done." "Stressed?" "A little. My computer malfunctioned. I lost some important files." Diane closed her book and placed it on the table. "Oh, that's too bad. Did you have backups?" "No, it was just some insignificant documents." "Is that so?" She tilted her head, her gaze flickering as if observing a small, trembling animal. Sometimes the things we consider insignificant are precisely the most important. Richard looked at her, trying to read something in her eyes, but found only an unnerving stillness.